mama to give me a name, but I lost it deep in them holes long time ago. Don't matter, I expect. Ain't nobody gonna remember anyhow. Think I was about 30 when them explosions hit. A whole bunch of us went on to glory down there then. A lot of white folk too. But they ain't never gonna remember any of us, 'cause we just a bunch of coal miners. And no rich man never, ever gave a lick about a coal miner.
In 1986, construction workers in Midlothian, Virginia made a startling discovery: the skeletal remains of 226 persons buried in a field that was destined to become a new shopping center. Locals remember the discovery, although only vaguely, and that removal of the bodies happened quickly and under somewhat of a veil of secrecy. There was little media attention, something the land developer had no doubt been glad to see, as prying eyes would inevitably slow down or even stop progress on what was then a multi-million-dollar project that had to be finished on time and on budget. So who were these people, and why were they buried in such large numbers anonymously? The clues to unraveling the mystery are scattered within the complicated history of coal in Chesterfield County and Midlothian itself.
I'm just an old coal miner and I labor for my bread. This story in my memory I've here told. For the sake of wife and baby, how a miner risks his life for the price of just a little lump of coal.
For a time, it was the coal capital of a new world. Its reach extended to every port on the eastern coast of the then British colonies in America, as well as all of the empire's protectorates in the Caribbean. But the great Chesterfield County coal rush had a humble enough beginning. Coal in America was discovered in the early 1700s, just miles from the mines of Chesterfield County. But the Midlothian mines lay claim to being the first commercial sellers of coal in what was then the British colonies of America.
And it was a perfect fit. You have fledgling industrial industries, a fledgling coal mining industry, and the two just melted together so very nicely. You couldn't take a Coppers Corporation, for example, and expect the Richmond coal to feed what they would need. But they certainly could feed an infant Tredegar Iron Works, for example. And as a result, it becomes a symbiotic relationship.
The long but narrow band of coal that was discovered in the area stretched from Goochland and Powhatan counties at its northwesternmost boundary, south and east to Chesterfield County. Its seams were rich in bituminous coal, a softer, more brittle type of the rock, and were the result of a geological anomaly of sorts. As such, it was younger coal, millions of years younger, in fact. In length, it stretched no more than 34 miles, instead of the hundreds of miles in coal-producing areas to the north and the west.
For the first 40 or so years, not only was Midlothian the first coal mines in North America, they were the only coal mines in North America. Until 1750 or 55, if you wanted coal, you used Midlothian coal.
But in the beginning, the first mines in the county were little more than shallow holes in the ground, no more than 40 feet in depth, the length of a long wooden ladder. and the coal harvested from them was sold and used almost exclusively for home heating. Known as bell holes, a digger would shovel down as far as his ladder would go, harvest the coal from that location, then climb back to ground level, walk 10 feet or so, and begin the process again. Dig, harvest, and move. But as the region's appetite for coal increased and diversified to more industrial uses, mining shallow holes would eventually prove inadequate. Farmers turned coal miners would have to dig deeper, much deeper, underground. But they had no idea of the dangers that lurked in the belly of the earth.
We were just a train stop, not a town or not even a village. Just a few families on farms for the longest time. It would be coal that would transform Midlothian into a real village. Julia Lavinia Woolrich.
And so it would be for other areas of the county, at least for a time. The mines would make plantation owners turned coal barons wealthy beyond their dreams, but would do so for the first 100 years of their history, largely on the backs of African American slaves.
The mines were built by mules and slave labor. And so in the mines themselves, you had about 3/5 of the labor were slaves. The other 2/5 consisted of freed blacks, consisted of whites that were born in and around here, and in later years it consisted of whites that came from Europe.
Mines were so profitable some would become family dynasties. In 1789, the year the United States Constitution was enacted, the mines of Midlothian were already selling their coal in places as far away as Philadelphia for 1 shilling 6 pence a bushel. And the 7 mines operating in and around the area at that time, all of them operations composed of intermarriage of local families, had an iron grip monopoly on coal for the rapidly growing young nation, delivering more than 1 million bushels of the oily black rock each year, including to the Jefferson White House. 2 of the richest and most influential mine barons were the Heath and Wooldridge families. Over the years, their mines would increase in size and stature, and so would the power of the men and the women who controlled them.
The Heath family, Blackheath, it's spelled H-E-T-H. They pronounced it Heath. They were Scottish people, and as true Scots, they didn't want to have to pay for the A. But they were really nice people. They were great Presbyterians. They were lousy mine managers. Instead of using a 20 by 20 column, they'd use a 10 by 10, and then they'd chip into that. Long story short, they didn't have enough coal to support it, so they had a bunch of cave-ins there, killed a lot of people. They undermined their own home. It went into the ground like Roderick Usher's. Just one day it just collapsed. They did the same thing right on Old Buckingham Road, where the first Melchizedek Church was. They undermined it. It started to sink into the ground on a Wednesday night when they were having a prayer meeting, and they had to escape through the windows because it came down so quickly. And the little chasm is still there.
The largest coal seam east of the Mississippi is located at Blackheath. And these guys really didn't understand underground mining methods and things like that. I read one account where a visitor to the Blackheath mines went underground, and for roof support, they were using trees. And they said it was just the oddest feeling to walk through the mine, feeling like you're in some sort of subterranean forest. That must have been really something to see.
The ruins of Heath's mines are long since gone, but their legacy of shoddy construction and slipshod mining techniques remains in evidence even today. The property in and around what were once the mines remains a patchwork quilt of seemingly endless networks of underground shafts and tunnels that burrowed under everything. During construction around the abandoned mines in the late 1970s, a bulldozer fell into a partially collapsed but completely hidden passageway and dropped about 40 feet into the ground, with the operator barely escaping with his life. The Blackheath mines were eventually signed over to a firm known simply as the English Company, which took a dim view of slave labor and began a steady reduction in the use of slaves as more Europeans began immigrating to the area. But by the 1830s, with the gopher tracks of mine explorations and cave-ins still on the property and fresh in the memory of Midlothian's community, the old Blackheath mines remained infamous as the most dangerous and ill-run facilities in the business. Still, the allure of the coal rush was undeniable. The mines of Chesterfield County appeared to many up until the mid-1800s as golden chariots, carrying anyone hitching a ride on them to the land of milk and honey. It would be a generation later, after Henry Heath and his family had essentially abandoned their coal mining operations, that brothers Abraham and Archibald Woolridge would establish coal mining facilities in Midlothian, with housing for miners, a hospital, school and company store, and a steadily evolving utilization of new technologies at their operation. Abraham, the eldest of the two, would emerge as the driving force behind expansion and modernization of the family's less sophisticated coal extraction efforts begun by their father in the mid-1700s, after coal was discovered on Woolridge property. The brothers dubbed their new company A&A Woolridge, but Archibald, a doctor, would choose to spend most of his time as a practicing physician, including serving in 1829 as head of a makeshift hospital treating an outbreak of deadly smallpox. Each in their own ways, the Woolridge brothers were unorthodox thinkers for men of the 1800s, and the transformation and expansion of their family's coal mines would not only bear their imprimatur, but would bring about what can only be characterized as a truly unique way to conduct business underground.
In many cases, because the guys that created the mines knew more about how the mines worked, when you were working in the mine for 12 hours a day, your boss or your superintendent very well may have been a slave. And you being a white Virginian or a white Scotsman or Irishman or Frenchman or wherever are working underneath a slave. At the end of your shift, you go home to your wife and children. The slave went to the slave quarters.
Go down, Moses.
Slaves even had a church of their own on land loaned by the Woolridge family. Formed in 1846 as the first African-American Baptist Church of Coalfield, it was an offshoot of a gathering of more than 800 slaves that worshiped regularly at nearby Cox's Meeting House in Spring Creek. Rising from humble roots, the church would go on to foster generations of African-American leaders, educators, lawyers, physicians, as well as a successful entrepreneurial class of tradesmen and business persons, starting in the mid-1800s, who helped establish and nurture Midlothian into a thriving community. And while some point to establishment of slave churches as a benevolent act of enslavers, other historians believe it had a darker, more practical purpose. Dr. Laurinette Lee grew up in the church, now known as Midlothian First Baptist.
The coal mine owners realized that in order to keep a workforce, they would have to create some place of worship, especially when the coal miners themselves were pushing for it, advocating for it. Just like with the founding of America, initially, most of the enslaved people that came over were men, but slave owners realized in order to grow a enslaved workforce, they needed to have women. And so we began to see an influx of women coming in. Something similar to that happened with the idea of creating a church, and a church where enslaved people could worship. Now, keep in mind, 1830s or so, laws changed. And so when there was a gathering of any group of African Americans, particularly when you started thinking of 7 or more individuals, a white male had to be present. And so the first ministers were white ministers. That changed after the Civil War. And there were other changes that took place after the Civil War as well. But that idea of having a church is a thread that continued all through history.
I am a jovial collier lad, as blithe can be. And let the times be good or bad, they're all the same to me.
By 1820, what had been seen early on as a fast way to earn wealth was fast becoming, for the larger mines, an expensive and bumpy road to continued prosperity. The game which had yielded so much coal so quickly was beginning to flash warning signs. Some coal fields were beginning to play out, yielding less of the rock and taking longer to do it. To stay in the game, owners would have to invest more, much more, in new safety and coal extraction systems, additional labor, and as important, the discovery of bigger seams of new coal. But their quest for riches would come at an enormous human cost. By 1841, there would be a split of sorts in the mining business. Many family-owned mining enterprises were being snapped up by larger corporations and mining syndicates. Abraham Woolridge was having none of it.
Corporate mines are dens of iniquity and cruelty where only the worst slaves congregate. I allow no liquor here. Our mines are manned by able-bodied, healthy, and well-disposed Negro men, most of them temperance men. They are better trained, fed, clothed, and attended to in sickness. Major Abraham Woolridge.
But with growth came consequences. After all, the first mine operators were farmers and plantation owners who knew little or nothing about the dangers lurking beneath the ground.
So the ventilation system for the mines was basically the same type of thing that the Romans had used, where you dug a shaft straight down, you did a horizontal shaft through the ore that you were mining, and then you did another vertical shaft up, and to move air around, you would light a fire at the second chimney. That would draw clean, fresh air down, and the smoke and the bad air would go up. If you're mining for copper, tin, gold, or whatever mineral, that all works very well. But when you're in a coal mine and you have a mine that's coal made out of decayed vegetable matter, you have all sorts of different gases that are created by the formation of the coal. You had black damp, white damp, fire damp, all sorts of these different gases, carbon monoxide down there, radon down there. All of these are colorless, all of these are odorless, and almost all of them are extremely flammable. So to move air around, you not only have a fire going on down there, but you also have all the coal miners at that time, for them to see, would put candles in the shafts, and for their hats, they would melt a candle on the top of their hat. So everybody's walking around with open fires with all of these different gases. So each one of the mining companies would hire a fellow, they called him a fireman or a gas man, and this fellow's job was to walk through the mines with a candle on about a 3 or 4 foot long stick, and he would wave that back and forth, hoping to flash off the gases before it developed into a large mass of gas. And if he was fortunate, then that's what would happen, and the gas would flash off and he would continue on about his way. If he was not very fortunate, then he would be atomized and the mining company had to hire another gas man or fireman. And the locals always said that you could always tell the person who was a gas man because he didn't have any eyebrows.
By 1839, in an attempt to resurrect his family's mining operations, son John Heath would travel to Britain in search of investors. Before he left, he'd ordered exploration of a shaft on an area of the family's old Blackheath mines, in the hopes he could demonstrate progress in finding new sources of coal. But his work crew got more than they bargained for when an errant flame touched off a massive gas explosion at a depth of about 700 feet.
Since there was so much coal, 50 foot of coal, you figure that's all the way to the ceiling. They could get in there and just grab all they can, but then again, you got roof control to consider, you got water to consider. What was left when they got done in that area, or nearly done in that area, is essentially ruined ground. It'd be difficult to go back in and remine places that were already mined.
News of the explosion arrived just as Heath was about to nail down financing in London, and the grim news that 40 slaves had died must have put a damper on the discussions. He learned later that of the 56 men in the mine at the time of the explosion, 53 had perished. Undaunted, Heath convinced a cadre of English mining engineers and experienced foremen to travel with him back to Virginia to help improve what he now knew was a dismal safety situation, renewing fears of locals that the death pall that had hung over the old Blackheath mines had never left. A news dispatch described the aftermath.
So great was the consternation and dismay that the accuracy of details could not be relied on, and so great was the terror among all in the vicinity that the proper efforts could not be promptly made to get out the unfortunate laborers. The Richmond Enquirer.
Heath would nail down his investors, the English company he had been courting, but would eventually take a back seat in the management of the mines, choosing to let his experts conduct business underground and allowing him to play around the margins by investing in other mines, including the newly formed Midlothian Coal Mining Company. It could be said that 1835 was the zenith of the Woolridge family mining operations. What had started out years before on a 400-acre plot of land was now a sprawling enterprise occupying more than 1,800 acres. It was also the year the company began selling stock in the Midlothian Coal Mining Company under the provisions of a charter from the Virginia General Assembly. But given the family's aversion to corporate mines, only a third of the stock would be offered to the public. The remaining 2/3 would be held steadfastly by Woolridge family members. The stock offering would generate $100,000 in new capital for the company, an exceptional sum in the mid-1800s. But in a harbinger of things to come, the money, all of it spent on new equipment, would be exhausted in a matter of weeks, as the need for improvements quickly devoured the cash. That there was plenty of coal on the Woolridge properties, there was no question. The problem was getting to it, and that meant digging deep underground shafts. Construction of that magnitude would take years to complete before the first substantial cargo loads of coal could be hoisted out of the ground. It would take every bit of determination and operating capital the newly formed Midlothian Coal Mining Company and the Woolridge brothers, their sisters, and their in-laws could muster. The brothers envisioned 4 new shafts spread out in different directions into areas the company wanted to expand their mining operations. By 1836, work would begin on the so-called middle shaft, 700 feet deep. Eventually, they would branch out and build the wood shaft, the grove shaft, and the pump shaft, named for an immense Cornish pump that removed hundreds of thousands of gallons of groundwater that persistently kept flooding the underground areas of new construction. Abraham Woolridge would be on a non-stop hunt for new investors, a difficult task made more so by the county's remoteness from Richmond's financial elite and several large economic depressions in the early and mid-1800s. But the work eventually paid off. Once the 4 shafts were up and running, business at the Midlothian Coal Mining Company skyrocketed, and the Woolridge family, all of whom held the majority of the company's stock, had become truly rich, among the richest families in all of Central Virginia. The addition of steam engines that would speed the retrieval of underground coal to the surface, the gravel paving of a road that would eventually become the Midlothian Turnpike, and construction of the state's first railroad, a gravity-fed cyclonic system that moved coal downhill from the mines, then uphill in the direction of the docks at Manchester several miles away. All of it gave the area's mines a competitive advantage no other potential coal-producing area in the young nation had: a working transportation system that would move coal to market faster than mule or horse-powered coal carts. For the Woolridges, and anyone else for that matter that had coal on their property and a determination to go after it, it must have felt like the sky had opened up and rained down a flood of cash. But rain clouds of a different kind were just over the horizon, and they would bring with them new and unforeseen challenges, and set the country on a collision course over the institution of slavery. Over at the old Blackheath properties, with the 1838 explosion still fresh in his mind, John Heath's faith in the exploration of coal was being tested by other smaller mishaps at facilities he now jointly owned with the English company. Moreover, he needed still more cash to cover the costs of mine improvements and continued exploration of new coal deposits. To raise the money, he began leasing lands under his control to others, namely the Woolridges and their Midlothian Coal Mining Company, while still hoping to make his own mining enterprises profitable with the help of those rent payments. But Heath was in hock up to his hips. The cost of modernizing the mines had left him nearly broke. He'd put on a brave face, but everyone in town would know the truth when he attempted to buy some of the Midlothian Coal Mining Company stock and quickly defaulted on the transaction. Wealthy Richmond investor and financial agent Nicholas Mills, himself a Midlothian coal mine owner under a partnership with the owners of the nearby Cunliffe family mines, swooped in and snapped up 30 of the shares Heath had attempted to purchase. John Heath wouldn't have to wait long before his shaky position in coal mining would be shattered. In 1844, an explosion and subsequent collapse at one of his mines claimed the lives of 8 people, most, if not all, African-American laborers, either freedmen or slaves. Heath would exit the mining business, leaving the English company in charge, but taking royalties on any coal removed by the company on any of the lands he had leased. He would get out just in time. In the nearly 2-century lifespan of the Chesterfield County coal mines, some experts say more than 500 men died in floods, fires, explosions, and collapses. And and probably more, since accurate records weren't kept in the 1700s. In the earliest tragedies, most of the victims were in fact African Americans, but death down below didn't discriminate. And as more Europeans immigrated to America and the need for coal grew, so did the body counts, but they became more racially balanced. History is clear that when most slaves died, owners buried them away from cemeteries of their own white families, segregation even in death. Some were accorded burial rights, but many were not. Forbidden from even gathering for a funeral or any other event, especially at night, following the infamous Nat Turner Rebellion, where slaves went on a white killing spree in Virginia's Southampton County. History is silent, however, on what happened at slave burials in Chesterfield County. So what about white immigrant miners and locals who died in the mines?
The rituals of funerals and burials were not afforded to them. There was a distinct labor class. It involved slaves, and it also involved, particularly in the 1700s, and it seeped over into the 1800s, almost an involuntary servitude of whites who found their way to this country with the promise of a better life, and it might have been marginally better, but these individuals were considered almost as less than completely human. They rarely had family here, and they were here to do a job. And once they became incapable of doing the job, ultimately, and especially at the time of death, then they were literally disposed of.
In Midlothian's case, it may not have been that cut and dried. Many of the Europeans had been actively recruited by the big mine companies to move to Virginia because of their experience in mining and gas detection. And those same owners had attracted other miners, not just from Europe, but from around the state to relocate to Midlothian, essentially as homesteaders, dangling the chance to buy land on which a miner and his family might eventually build a home.
To the Irish working in the mines, of course, the Great Hunger, the potato famine started in 1845. And besides the 1 to 2 million Irish who died of starvation, over 1 million came to the United States. The Irish that came to America, of course, had nothing when they got here. And so for coal mining manufacturers or textile manufacturers or anybody that was in the manufacturing business, it was cheaper to hire Irish than it was to buy a slave. And it remained that way for the longest kind of time.
There were white common laborers, some from the village of Midlothian, who died in the mines as well. Presumably, casualties with family connections would be buried in the area's established cemeteries. The bodies of mine hands from Europe would, according to accounts, find their way into any number of makeshift grave sites, or in the case of the Methodists, at what had become known as the Miners' Cemetery, later Mount Pisgah Methodist. There would be few grave markers for many of those casualties, according to one historian, because many devout Methodists held fast to the belief that grave markers were symbols of vanity. The period from 1839 to 1882 could rightly be dubbed the decades of death, as mine casualties around the county occurred with an awful frequency, and in spite of improvements in mine ventilation and miner safety, including the advent of the so-called Davy safety lamp. The total number of casualties is probably unknowable, no matter how many times local historians count the dead. What is clear is that the first coal mines of the New World had become death traps, dangerous mines in an already dangerous occupation. A question rang out from the press and residents of the area. Was anyone responsible for the carnage?
When I was a boy, said my daddy to me, "Stay out of the mines, take my warning," said he, "or with dust you'll be choked, and a pauper you'll be broken down, down, down."
Whatever the reasons, beginning in 1830, there were informal consolidations of mine operations and a revolving door of ownership changes at both the Midlothian Coal Mining Company and the English Company, its formal name now the Chesterfield Iron and Coal Company, and its lands and mines occupying many of the old Blackheath properties. Both companies apparently saw opportunity in combining at least some of their resources under property sharing arrangements and other endeavors. Mine supervisors and engineers would move freely between the two companies, working for one, then the other at times. The firms had cooperated early on in building a hospital on property owned by the Woolridge family, site of which is generally understood to have been at or near land at the intersection of Old Buckingham Road and Midlothian Turnpike, and adjacent to some of the Heath and English Company land. But by 1841, the English Company, like John Heath, had had enough of Virginia coal mining. They leased their land and mines outright to the Woolridge family for a royalty on coal extracted by the Midlothian Company, and then promptly ceased operations. So too would Nicholas Mills end active participation in his mines. The one-time president of Virginia's first railroad, and arguably the richest man in the state, Mills would continue to play around the edges of coal investment, but no longer as a mine owner. He sold his interest in coal mines to the Woolridge family and became a board member of the Midlothian Coal Mining Company. But while others were getting out, the Woolridge family was doubling down in their quest for more coal and money. By 1840, furnaces that had generated heat to lift gases and stale air out of the mines were beginning to be shifted from below ground to the surface, and would eventually be augmented and then replaced by enormous fans powered by steam engines that would more properly ventilate mine shafts. But the improvements were neither quick nor adequate in many cases, leaving some area mines with fire-breathing furnaces deep in their shafts long after the owners had been told about the imminent dangers of the practice. Moreover, the string of disasters that had planted so many seeds of doubt about the safety of the mines were now creating bigger problems for mine owners like the Woolridges. Attracting labor to the mines had always been a challenge, but with the deaths of so many miners, slave owners began refusing to lease their human resources to the mines, and free blacks, a growing population in Virginia, were taking note of the death toll as well. For mine owners, it was a simple equation: less labor meant less coal. One look at a map of Virginia's slave population in 1861 shows how much the mines depended upon slaves for labor. Many of Virginia's largest slave populations lay immediately within the confines of the Richmond Coal Basin. Disenchanted slave owners meant fewer slaves working in the mines, a dire situation for mine operators. That is, until an ambitious insurance agent in Richmond came up with an idea: to sell life insurance policies on slaves. It was an especially attractive offer for slave owners, especially those who owned workers in dangerous occupations. And it was simple enough. When an insured slave died, his owner would get paid 3/4 of the value of his slave, but not a penny for the widow or his children. Nicholas Mills would take out policies on 24 of his slaves while he was still in the mining business, making him one of the biggest slave policy owners of the then Nautilus Mutual Life Insurance Company, later New York Life. Initially, the policies were a big success, and the practice spread like wildfire across the South. Soon, owners were insuring their slaves in states as far away as Mississippi, but many of those policies were written on favored field hands or slaves who were skilled artisans. For For mining jobs, the profit rate on the policies tanked, and the life insurance company decided to end the experiment in slave insurance policies shortly thereafter. But mine owners had already concluded that the offer of life insurance policies on slaves and even white miners couldn't overcome a labor shortage founded on fear. The steady drumbeat of casualties would push the mines to take out newspaper advertisements touting the increased safety of their operations, and nudge the Woolridge family into a new requirement for employment. Anyone hired, even slaves, had to agree to work underground, and included a signed affidavit from 6 respected locals as an added measure of authenticity. But slave owners still had doubts about the safety of the mines, and most of the free blacks the companies were courting had little or no confidence in the promises of the white establishment. But the mine owners believed they had a secret weapon at their disposal, a German-born architect and engineer named Oswald J. Heinrich, who had been persuaded to leave his teaching job in Richmond and help join other engineers and supervisors in the quest for safer mines. Heinrich's agreement to do so initially buoyed the confidence of the mine owners, and they hoped the public too, that science and skill might finally forestall more disasters.
It is true that within the last few years several disastrous accidents have occurred, but from the scientific and practical skill attracted to the mines, these accidents will be of rare occurrence, it is to be hoped. Major Abraham Woolridge.
I'm a free man, 1850, and I'm looking for a job. I don't feel like growing tobacco, so okay, I understand they're hiring at the Bright Hope or wherever. All right, if you have that mental ability to, all right, I'm going down this hole with the understanding that I may not be coming back out, that takes a special sort of person, all right? However, the people I feel bad for were the people that did not have any choice in the matter. They were said, you get in that hole and you don't come out until your shift's over.
It's important to remember that coal miners got paid for what came to the surface. A coal miner would work a 12-hour day, but in that 12-hour day, that coal miner also is digging into the face of the coal. The 2 men, you and I, who are working as a team, we not only have to dig into the face of the coal, but we have to lay additional railroad track from where we started to where we are now. We also had to do the cribbing or whatever to keep roof of the coal tunnel from collapsing on top of us. So we have to do these safing operations. So in a given 12-hour day, you and I are only going to be actually producing coal for about 8 hours out of that 12. And we've got to make that quota. In 1870, you were paid $75 a month working in the mines here in Virginia. Out of that $75, you had to pay $1 a month to the company doctor. You had to pay $1 a month for every child that you had in the company school, which they called the seminary. You were paid in script, typically, that was redeemed only at the company store. You had to buy your own clothes. You had to buy your own picks and shovels. None of that was furnished by the company. All of that came out of your pocket. So, Tennessee Ernie Ford's owing your soul to the company store was true in Midlothian. It was true in Kentucky. It was true in every coal mining town anywhere.
Tell me, what will a coal miner do? Tell me, what will a coal miner do when he go down in the mine? Joy loaders he will find. Tell me, what will a coal miner do?
There were periods of calm when things would appear almost normal. The one-time little train stop was now a bustling village, with as many as 50 families calling it home, with taverns, wood shops, blacksmith concerns, and even gambling parlors. But then, like a dormant volcano roaring back to life, the fragile peace of the little village would be shattered by still more explosions. Violent quakings of the earth felt for miles around, and the clanging, the incessant clanging of alarm bells. Nothing, it seemed, not the new engineers and more experienced mine supervisors, could stop the horrific parade of mine mishaps. And with each of them, public opinion turned more and more against the mine owners, especially when casualty lists included the names of children working in the mines, like 13-year-old Jonathan Jewett, who perished in an explosion. In 1852, at what would eventually become the Woolridge family's Maidenhead pits through a lease agreement with John Heath, disaster struck again. Abraham Woolridge's words of assurance in the newspapers had come back to haunt him.
"34 persons were instantly killed, and a number of others so badly burned that little or no hopes are entertained of their recovery. Some of the dead men, the flesh charred on their bones, still held their shovels in their hands. Those who were not dead begged earnestly not to be left, and then prayed loudly for a few drops of cold water." Major Abraham Woolridge.
Barely 2 years later, 11 more miners died back at the English Company mines in another gas explosion. Another 55 slaves died in a subsequent explosion in 1855 in the Woolridge's Midlothian coal pits. Before they would cease operation in the 1870s, additional eruptions took the lives of an unspecified number of black miners, some of whom now lived underground to care for mules. In many cases, the mine companies took up collections for the widows and orphans and solicited help in the newspapers for larger donations. Several contributions of $500 and more were made by Richmond's well-to-do. But the 1852 explosion had left nearly 100 miners' children fatherless, and their wives without a place to live. There were no reports of where any of the casualties were buried, or if any families of black miners ever received some of the aid. But something else was in the offing by 1861, an irrepressible civil war. War required cannon and shot, and the arsenals and foundries of Virginia required coal to meet the need. Local historians say some of the mine owners were doing pretty well, being paid in Confederate money, of course. In fact, when Union troops arrived in Midlothian days after the surrender at Appomattox, they found the Midlothian Coal Mining Company largely unmanned. But they also found several barrels of Confederate currency at the Woolridge mines, indicating business, at least for some, had been booming right up until the end of the war. Other area mines had been financially brought to their knees by the end of the struggle. Some closed, but still more tried to remain open, this time with labor from newly emancipated free black miners and a continuing wave of immigrants. But when the fighting stopped, so did the Southern war machine, and the Confederate money, all of it was worthless. But there was still plenty of coal in the ground, the mine owners prophesied, and there was no better time than now to invest.
It was a very hard time. It was a time when we had come out of a war. blacks and whites had lost family members. The landscape was just desolate. More battles were fought in Virginia than in any other place. And so there are instances when people were coming down from the north, particularly school teachers. They noted how desolate the landscape was. You know, they would see the bones of carcasses still lying about, buildings burnt down, places where it seemed like life had just left the community, that there really was no community. But community still did exist, even in spite of all of this devastation that surrounded them. We have to keep in mind also the attitudes of people. Many whites who had owned people before, many enslavers, now had to face the fact that they were to consider these formerly enslaved people as equals. That was a hard thing for them. It was unfathomable, really. And they could no longer demand anything from them. They couldn't force them to work. They couldn't force them to bow before them. It was a totally different world. And it was a different world for African Americans who were now in search of family members who had been taken from them, stolen from them, really. When we think of the historical timeline, we think of 1865 as the marking date for the end of slavery. And we can say, yes, legally, it was over. However, when we look at the day-to-day experiences of people, and people who lived in places like Midlothian, the conditions did not seem like slavery was over.
Despite the devastation, it was a heady time for people who had never known anything but subjugation and mandatory labor. Former slaves could now buy land, they could vote, and under new constitutions in former slave states like Virginia, they were legally equal to whites. It was a period of unprecedented gains for African Americans, but the reforms would be short-lived and would, in the South and in other areas, be gradually replaced by a harsh and unforgiving system of legalized segregation and discrimination, one that would dominate race relations for generations to come. Earth-shaking as many of the reforms were under Reconstruction, the coal mines of Chesterfield County were 15 miles away from all the hoopla and disruption, and as such, insulated from the political and social upheavals of the big city. For the everyday coal miner, Reconstruction was a faraway phenomenon, if they heard much about it at all, a phenomenon with little, if any, effect on their existence and the danger and low pay of their work.
I don't think life for miners changed too much because profit was still king. And the mine owners still were able to make a profit and did so, oftentimes at the expense of the miners, because the conditions were hazardous, horribly unsafe. And most of the mine owners didn't put any of their revenue into making them safe for the miners. The miners were considered expendable. If they died, there's always a workforce that can come and fill those places.
In the wake of the war, many Chesterfield County coal mine owners struggled anew to attract operating capital. Before the hostilities, the Woolridge family owned 4 manor houses in or near Midlothian, each with 18 to 30 slaves. Now, like everyone else in the mining business, the Woolridge clan had fallen upon hard times. A bitter and unrepentant Southern press corps would howl in newspapers about the heavy yoke of punishment, as well as the economic hardship that Reconstruction would likely trigger, ignoring the fact that the assassination of Abraham Lincoln had in part unleashed the Northern fury against the South.
Admitting that the South is conquered territory, did any modern nation ever confiscate the lands of another nation after having conquered it? Did even Catherine of Russia do it? The Richmond Daily Dispatch.
And hardship it did bring. The Woolridges would sell their landmark home, Midlothian, and unload many other trappings of wealth. It was a sell-off that began as early as 1828, when the Woolridges undertook efforts to expand coal extraction into areas that hadn't already been exhausted. And then again, a few years later, as the family tried to raise money for their new Midlothian coal mining company. But the war had further tightened the economic vice on the family, as it would every other business in the area, as local investment capital for mine expansion and renovation vanished, and with it, hopes of a speedy restoration of trade with the North. Unaccustomed to foraging for investment capital outside their home state or region, many Chesterfield County mine owners would now have to look west and north for money. Confederate veteran William Woolridge, Abraham's son, would take over the reins of the Midlothian Coal Mining Company in 1866. Hobbled by amputation of one of his legs after being wounded in the war, Woolridge would nonetheless have himself lowered into the subterranean passageways of his mines on a regular basis to personally inspect the dark interior chambers where new faces of coal were being unearthed. His return from the war must have been a relief to the family, and not only because William had survived battle wounds that had nearly claimed his life, but also because in the colonel's absence, the task of overseeing the mining business may have fallen heavily on the shoulders of his 5 children. In addition to the burdens of Reconstruction, Northern coal from Pennsylvania and Ohio had become tough, unyielding competition as the war cut off, if not all, most commercial trade between North and South. The only way to stay in the game, Woolridge knew, was to boost coal production, and fast. And for that, he'd need more cash, and a lot of it. He hurried through a new issuance of company stock, hoping to pump the only legal tender in post-war Virginia, U.S. dollars, into his now flailing company, specifically for construction of a new, even deeper mine shaft, one that would plunge to a depth of 1,000 feet or more. If coal was anywhere to be found, Colonel William Woolridge thought to himself, he'd find it, or die trying. There were few, if any, takers on the offer to buy stock in a small-town coal company, especially one in war-torn Virginia. If he was to salvage what was left of his family's coal mining legacy, he knew he'd have to find another way to raise cash. Then he did something that would have been unthinkable to his family a generation earlier. To cover his bets on mine expansion, Woolridge took out what he hoped would be a short-term loan of $180,000, no doubt swallowing hard not just on the incredible amount of money he was borrowing, but the fact that his fortunes and those of his family now rested with a Yankee banker from upstate New York. Before too long, Colonel William Woolridge would learn just how apt the name of his new mine would be. Complicating attempts to resurrect Chesterfield County coal mining was the unsavory reputation the mines had developed among out-of-state investors. The stop-and-start rhythm of coal mining in the area, made worse for some by the 4-year war, and worse still by memories of old disaster headlines, had left many mine shafts temporarily abandoned, flooded, and their timbers weakened. It would take serious money and time to bring them back to life. Ventilation for shafts was also expensive, and only served to underscore the danger of the business when mine owners pitched their proposals to moneyed interests, that safety required a hefty financial commitment. When it became clear that many investors were turning up their noses at opportunities to bet on the county's operations, some coal mine operators began to restart mines on their own. They poured what they could scavenge in to pay for workers, but began spending less, if anything at all, on some of the more vital safety precautions underground, especially shaft ventilation. And when explosions and collapses began occurring again, the mining engineer who had been brought in to improve safety suddenly found himself on the defensive. He wasted no time in blaming, albeit diplomatically, the mine owners and their operators.
The accidents arise from the circumstances that many of the area's coal mines had to be abandoned from time to time, if not entirely, on account of fires caused by spontaneous combustion. All of them are due to ignorance, lack of systems, and false economy. Oswald J. Heinrich.
Talk about the coal barons, robber barons of the Appalachian basins, and those were the same sorts of mentality, the owners, that the owners in the Richmond coalfield probably had. I don't know that for sure, but there are indications, looking at Mr. Heinrich, for example, he's saying, okay, we need to do this. And they're saying, no, that's too expensive. We're going to do it this way. And he's sitting there going, okay, guys, we'll see how this is going to work out. And it didn't work out.
Read all about it. Get your newspapers here. Mine disasters. Get your newspapers here.
But the bigger mines that had prospered in the West and North during the war had problems of their own. They too were experiencing cave-ins and explosions. And it was something of a reprieve for local mines. Public attention on coal disasters would no longer be focused just on Chesterfield County. Yet something was about to happen that would put the mines of Chesterfield County back on the front page and refocus the nation's attention on the human costs of coal mining in a region that had already suffered more than its share of disaster and death. An early morning sun was barely peeking over the trees as a lone gasman sat on the front step of the mine operations building, warming his hands on a cup of stout black coffee. It was cold for April, barely 2 weeks since the winds of March had begun to settle in for warmer weather. It would be 60 degrees down below in the mines, he reminded himself, as he pulled on his work gloves and walked slowly to the lift that would carry him 900 feet into the earth. Nodding to the lift operator, the gasman signaled his readiness to be lowered away. The lift operator engaged the steam-powered winch as the gasman trained his gaze downward to acclimate his eyes to the darkness of his destination. It was just another day in the coal mines. Down below, the gasman walked cautiously between subterranean passageways, ensuring that the ventilation doors were working correctly, keeping stale or gassy air from intruding into areas where the men would later be working that morning. It was his job to detect any hint of flammable or odorless gases like methane, which would easily ignite and set off a catastrophe. After 15 minutes, he signaled the lift operator to bring him up. All looked well, and the gasman breathed a sigh of relief. A large group of miners were gathered at the shaft entrance, anxiously awaiting the go-ahead to begin work. The gasman rose from the ground and gave the thumbs-up signal. 4 stainless steel posts and the remnants of a massive ventilation shaft are all that remains of the Bright Hope mine, which bragged the safest shafts in all of Chesterfield County. But it was to earn a dubious distinction for nearly 20 years, as having claimed the lives of more miners than any other coal mine in the United States. 69 men, 39 black and 30 white, died in a massive explosion of gas that could be heard and felt for miles. And the subsequent collapse, fire, and flood that would obliterate the mine's central passageways. A newspaper carried a report from the scene.
The mouth of the pit was soon surrounded by some hundreds of persons, and the shrieks, moans, and lamentations were indeed harrowing. Stern men who had faced the horrors of the Civil War were unable to bear the heart-rending scene and wept like children turning away. The Petersburg Index.
Some would later claim that the gas man was drunk and that he had failed to secure doorways leading from the main shaft into other areas, but who could know for certain? Later, the accident would be officially blamed on atmospheric conditions, where the so-called upcast of air from the mine became cooler than the temperatures of the mid-April air outside, keeping explosive gases down below from rising to the surface. The mine foreman, a final report said, did not expect the air inversion, and, believing there was no danger, had permitted men to descend into the hole and go to work. There would be several attempts to locate bodies, but the explosion had started an underground inferno, and until it was extinguished, there could be no search parties. An awful silence descended on the grounds as word spread that recovery efforts would have to be suspended, at least for the night, and perhaps indefinitely. The bodies of 36 men were eventually recovered, but the remaining men, press reports said, had either been blown to atoms by the explosion, or claimed by the fumes of the long-burning fire or the subsequent flooding of the shaft that was required to finally extinguish the flames. The bodies of those men remain buried in the breaches of the mine. Just miles up the road from Winter Park, the Midlothian Coal Mining Company was in a death struggle of its own. It had taken years to carve out what Colonel Woolridge had dubbed the sinking shaft on the far northwest corner of his family's land. A cavity more than 1,000 feet deep had indeed been dug, and core samples made 300 feet even deeper. But there was no coal, only granite, shale, and mud. Woolridge had literally bet the ranch on the new sinking shaft, and when the hole came up without any coal, he knew he was in trouble. Out of money and deeply in debt, he'd be forced to sign over ownership of his family's crown jewel to banker R.S. Burroughs of Albion, New York, the man from whom he had borrowed $180,000. The mine properties were ordered sold at public auction, but there were few, if any, serious offers, save Burroughs, who wanted to recoup losses on his loan. Woolridge had no choice. He scrawled his name on the trustee papers transferring ownership of the mines and their equipment to Burroughs, and leaning on his crutch and using his one good leg, hobbled from the auction house in utter despair. The Woolridge dream of a continuing coal mine dynasty was over. But Roswell Burroughs had more in mind than simply collecting on a debt. He himself had managed to catch coal fever and saw the Midlothian mines as a quick way to extend his economic reach into the South. The wealthy banker and investor had big plans for revitalizing his newly acquired coal company mines, including the old Grove shaft, flooded and inactive for more than a year. But tragedy and bad luck, the millstones around the neck of so many of the area's mine owners, was about to cost the Burroughs family and 32 other families dearly. By February 1882, it had been 6 years since Midlothian had experienced a major mining mishap, the last killing 8 men in Grove Shaft, and that happening under the management of New York banker Roswell Burroughs, who, like the Woolridges, was now struggling with both the cost and the science of requirements needed to update miner safety underground, on top of the money he had spent to rehabilitate Grove Shaft, which was now up and running again. But attention in Midlothian and other mining communities was likely focused elsewhere, as Alexander Graham Bell's newfangled telephone was being sold to the masses as the communications wave of the future. Thomas Edison had brought electric lights to a small section of Menlo Park, New Jersey, and shortly thereafter to a larger area of Cleveland, Ohio. All the while, Americans were grappling with the repercussions of the nation's second political assassination, President Garfield being gunned down by a delusional misfit named Charles Guiteau. Elsewhere, America was in transition, and so were the coal mines of Chesterfield County. The mines, their output down from pre-Civil War levels, had nevertheless helped grow the area's populations. Midlothian was now a town in its own right, with nearly 2,300 residents, and Chesterfield County boasted more than 25,000 tax-paying citizens. The years of relative calm in the mines and the remarkable march of science and technology could have only instilled hope that works in the depths of the earth had finally, too, entered a more safe and modern age. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, after a winter storm was tapering off from the night before, all that would change. Newspapers around the country carried the horrific news.
Gangs of miners worked all last night, making preparations to descend the shafts this morning and recover the dead bodies of the men entombed in the bowels of the earth. Women whose husbands had left their sides but a few hours before, in robust health, walked about the dark streets of the village, wailing and crying for those they would never again see alive. The Washington Evening Star.
Recovery efforts were a nightmare in the snow. 32 men died. Down below, more than 600 feet, hell was in session, with the supports of the mines so obliterated by the blast and a subsequent flood that no one from above could make their way to the miners trapped below. Volunteers and supervisors from other mines rallied to the scene, while a small army of anxious, screaming widows begged for news of their husbands as they stood near the gaping, flooded, and mangled opening of the mine. Underground, the blast had set off a fire that burned white-hot, fueled by collapsed seams of easily ignitable bituminous coal. What had started as a rescue operation quickly turned into an attempt to recover the dead. The body of Isham Graves, who had been nearest the shaft entrance when the explosion occurred, was finally recovered.
Is there anyone down there?
But it was so badly burned, the mining supervisor told the newspapers, it had begun to decompose within a day. 4 other bodies were eventually recovered before rescue efforts were suspended entirely. Superintendent George Dobbs made the call.
There would be no need for the 27 coffins that had been sent out after the shaft was closed off to try and put the fire out. It is believed all the remaining men were slowly cremated.
It isn't known whether the 5 bodies recovered from Grove Shaft or those from the earlier explosion 6 years before at the same site were eventually buried. This time the public howled. The Grove Shaft explosion garnered more than just national headlines. It laid bare the fact that the mine owners had routinely put profits ahead of safety, not just in Midlothian, but all around the Richmond Coal Basin and throughout Chesterfield County. And leading the charge was the man the owners had hired years before, and then later tried to scapegoat for the continuation of mine accidents. In a scathing letter published in the Journal of Mining, an obviously angry Oswald Heinrich wrote of a litany of safety defects to which he said the mine owners had turned a blind eye, and for the first time, he described all of the abuses, which he detailed specifically in the article, as more than simple ignorance or benign neglect.
This calamity has been foretold by those familiar with the matter, and even reported to those with whom responsibility lay. That it has not occurred long ago is only a sign of the mercy of Providence. Such criminal defects, as stated above, could not be tolerated in those sections of the country where mining law exists without bringing the full penalty of the law upon those responsible for it.
Underground, you're dealing with you're in a container, so that yes, you'll get that whoosh, that fire, which quickly burns out because it quickly uses up the air. So you're doubly damned being in a methane explosion on the ground. One, that intense heat on your body. Two, that flame has used up all the oxygen, and they refer to that as black damp.
Heinrich's article was a damning indictment, calling the explosion and others like it a criminal act of negligence. And it was one the mine owners vigorously challenged, saying Heinrich hadn't been underground at Grove Shaft for at least a year. But for many, Heinrich's charges only served to underscore their own belief that the mine owners had been discounting underground safety for a long time and putting miners at extraordinary risk in the process. Some underground mine fires can burn for months, even years, feeding on thick seams of black oily coal, like so many millions of glowing charcoal briquettes, their heat advancing forward into new and deeper places, a fire barely glowing, but nevertheless eating up whatever was around it, just to stay alive. The same could be said of the county's struggling coal mines. The explosion of success that had been sparked in the early to mid-1800s had finally petered out, and what was left was only a slow-burning shadow of its former self. In the end, it was competition from coal producers in other regions and states that was the largest death blow to the mines. But the very public disasters at Bright Hope and Grove Shaft would be a coup de grace of sorts, and they stand today, for many historians, as markers of the practical end of Chesterfield County coal mining. Periodically, the newspapers would carry articles about new ventures that were afoot, all promising to revolutionize the county's mines with new investment capital and technological improvements. Each of the companies said virtually guaranteed their success. All of them would fail. The old Midlothian coal mining company properties changed hands at least 6 times after the Burroughs family unloaded them. The last major player, the Murphy Coal Company, would advance the prospect of a mining rebirth in Midlothian further than any other firm, only to be replaced in 1936 by a consortium of Richmond investors that wanted to try their hand. But in the end, the Richmond investors too would fail. The Murphy Coal Company left one legacy of its attempt to restart the mines of Midlothian, the only known photographs of a renovated Grove Shaft. But by 1937, for all intents and purposes, it was over.
Lord, Lord, hear that whistle when she blow. Oh, she blow like she never blowed before. Blow like she never blowed before.
In the midst of the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration employed jobless writers to do something of enormous importance: chronicle, through the words of the last living generation of former African American slaves, the everyday rituals of life and death of enslaved persons. On a Georgia farm in 1937, a 96-year-old woman was asked about the funeral rituals afforded to slaves. She was blunt and to the point.
There won't no time to grieve. They just buried us slaves quick.
One can only imagine whether her words held true for the 226 souls, whose skeletal remains were discovered in 1986 by developers building a shopping center at the corner of Old Buckingham Road and Midlothian Turnpike, on land that had once belonged to the Woolridge family, and on which a miners' hospital had been built a century before. Were the Woolridge and Heath mine owners, who worked jointly on construction of the old miners' hospital, and on land that abutted coal facilities owned by each of their companies, have been more compassionate in their treatment of slaves who died underground? History is silent on the issue. It is also silent whether the bodies discovered at the shopping center lot were those of miners, slave miners as some believe. Forensic anthropologist Tal Simmons, professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, says the way in which the skeletons were moved from the property to another burial site was a missed opportunity to determine at least something about the characteristics of the bodies, although given the year, she said, not unusual. Prior to 1992, discovery of potentially historically relevant skeletal remains in Virginia required only a court order and a licensed funeral director to move the bodies. But that year the requirements changed and included a prohibition against disinterring bodies like the Midlothian skeletons without a permit first from the State Department of Historic Resources. Had at least a basic examination of the skeletons been conducted by an experienced forensic anthropologist, Simmons says, we might know the sex, approximate age, and the racial characteristics of the dead, and whether any of the bones had distinctive markings or damage caused by long-term exposure to fire, both conditions in mine mishaps. But so much also depends on the condition of the soil in which the bodies were buried. In more acidic ground, bodies decompose faster, and anthropologists are left with only bone fragments and teeth to test and examine. At 2 hours per skeleton, even a basic examination of the bones would have taken more than 10 days. A long time for a developer trying to finish a project on time and on budget. The funeral director who oversaw the removal of the bodies from the Midlothian site said only two things about their condition. They appeared to be at least a century old and were poor, given the fact there were no metallic objects like jewelry recovered near the graves. Some pieces of fabric, the undertaker added, appeared to be the remnants of work clothes. A few local historians hang their hats on a coincidence that a tally of mine casualties in Midlothian during the decades of death come tantalizingly close to the number of skeletons recovered at the development site. But the violent nature of mine explosions, which newspapers of the time described as being blown to atoms, means there were, in so many cases, nothing to bury at all.
So what we normally do in a forensic analysis of skeletal remains is to lay those remains out on a table in anatomical relationship. And then when I'm conducting an exam, I normally go through the entire skeleton 4 times. The first time is simply to take inventory of all the bones that are present, any that might be, damaged or partially present in some way. I'll then go through and estimate what we call the biological profile, which is age, population affinity, sex, stature, and any antemortem conditions that might have affected the skeleton, either diseases or previous trauma that would leave their mark. I'll then go through again and look for any perimortem injuries, things that occurred around the time of death, and a last time to document anything that might have happened to that body after death, what we would call post-mortem damage.
It is a fair assumption the graves were those of blacks, including slaves and slave miners, in large measure because of the burial ground's unique location, on the property of a slave owner, the Woolridge family, and away from established white cemeteries like the old Mount Pisgah, or miners' cemetery, little more than a stone's throw away, where some presumably white miners were buried. The vast majority of the graves were individually dug, save one site described as a mass grave, and all of them at relatively shallow depths. The bodies were meticulously disinterred and reburied in Richmond's Maury Cemetery, in 40 or more simple concrete vaults, each containing 5 to 7 sets of remains, and at a cost of $60,000, paid for by the developer. For some time after the Midlothian skeletons were reinterred, there were no markers or memorials for any of the unknowns. Dr. Laurinette Lee says one of the final tragedies of the mines is that they not only took the lives of miners, but also robbed many of them, especially African Americans who died underground, of their identities, burying them as if their existence was inconsequential.
You have not been forgotten. You have not been forgotten. The work you did for your families, you've left a legacy that people have not acknowledged, that has not been recognized. But Midlothian wouldn't be what it is if it had not been for those mines and the people who worked in them.
Later, a granite marker would memorialize the spot where the skeletons were reburied. Whoever erected it did so without fanfare or public announcement. But it stands now in the middle of a large grassy place at the back of the Maury Cemetery, where the 226 restless souls of Midlothian were reinterred in 1986. Lost, but now found, it says, of the 234 unknown souls. 226 from the Midlothian site, and 8 more from somewhere else in Richmond. Found, but perhaps still restless in their anonymity.
But they ain't never gonna remember any of us, 'cause we just a bunch of coal miners.
This is your old friend Curly Sizemore, singing one of his own compositions, namely the Drill Man Blues. I used to be a drill man down at old Parley, drilling to slate and sand rock till it got the best of me. Rock dust has almost killed me. It's turned me out in the rain, for dust has settled on my lungs and causes me constant pain. I can hear my hammer rolling as I lay down for my sleep, for drilling is a job I love, and this I will repeat. It's killed 2 fellow workers here at old Parley, and now I've eaten so much dust, Lord, that it's killing me. I'm thinking of poor drill man away down in the mine, who from eating dust will end up with a fate just like mine. Oh Lord, Lord, oh Lord, Lord, hurt me so bad for us to part. But someday, baby, you ain't gonna worry my life anymore. So many nights since you've been gone, how much I'm gonna worry myself alone. But someday, baby, you ain't gonna worry my life anymore. many days since you went away. How much I'm gonna worry both night and day. But someday, baby, you ain't gonna worry my life anymore. So that's my story. All I have to say to you, bye bye, baby, don't care what you do. But someday, baby, you ain't gonna worry my life anymore. So many nights since you've been gone, how much I'm gonna worry myself alone. But someday, baby, you ain't gonna worry my life anymore.